s- okay, and with that, we can go to our next slide. I'm Floria Kruba. I'm the Midwest Farmland Coordinator, and I primarily provide support for our Wisconsin Farmland Protection Partnership. I'm based in Madison, Wisconsin, but I'm proud to call Illinois my home state. I'm always happy to be back, even if it's just virtually. I'm joined today by Angie Doucette, our AFT Midwest Farmland Protection Manager. Angie oversees the Wisconsin Farmland Protection Partnership and supports farmland transfer through AFT's Land Transfer Navigators program, and she is based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Also joining us today is Dylan Cook, our Midwest Policy Manager. You'll likely see a lot of him throughout the Illinois Soil Health Week. He is also the vegetable farmer of Cook Farms based in Bloomington, Illinois. And next slide, please. At American Farmland Trust, our mission is to save the land that sustains us, and our work is concentrated in three main areas to achieve this. The first is protecting farmland, which we'll explore more through this presentation today, promoting sound farming practices, and keeping farmers on the land. Next slide. So AFT has programming at the national and regional level. Myself, Angie, and Dylan are all on the Midwest regional team where we serve 8 states within the region. Through these programs, we provide support for farmland protection, farmland succession and transfer, land access, policy, conservation cropping and diversification, smart solar, watershed initiatives, and soil health initiatives. As you can see, we're working in a lot of different areas to support America's farmlands and farming communities. And with that, I will pass the presentation off to Angie.
Thanks, Burial. That was a wonderful introduction. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'm excited to dive in a little bit about, talk a little bit about the state of farmland in the US and Illinois more specifically. So as part of our Farms Under Threat initiative, AFT used high resolution spatial analysis to identify exactly where agricultural land has been converted to urban and low density residential land uses and to anticipate future threats. So through this analysis, we identified that in the span of 15 years, so between 2001 and 2016, the US converted 11 million acres of agricultural land, which is equal to converting about 2,000 acres a day, or put differently, all the land planted of fruits, nuts, and vegetables in 2017. So through this report, through this initiative, we found that low density residential land use, so that distributed large lot housing that may appear rural, but in fact often can exclude production of agriculture, represents a major threat to farmland across the country. So this low density residential sometimes occurs when individual houses and small housing clusters spread out along rural roads, which can fragment what used to be continuous blocks of ag land. This sometimes can create tension and slowly shift an area from being primarily agriculture to primarily residential. So during this time period, 2001 to 2016, 7 of the 11 million acres that were converted converted to this low density residential use, further fragmenting the agricultural landscape. And so, sorry, I'm managing a couple slides here. And here's why this matters. So our country's most significant ag land, meaning the best land in the country for producing crops, especially human edible food crops, is finite. So I know when we drive around rural Illinois, it may feel like our productive agricultural lands go on forever. But as you can see in this map, that in fact is, it's simply not the case. We call this land in green nationally significant agricultural land. And the reason I show this map is to indicate that our best farmland is not infinite. We're talking about a finite resource that we believe at AFT should be protected. So looking at Illinois, what does that look like in our state? In Illinois, 23 million acres, or 84% of Illinois' ag land is considered that nationally significant soils that I mentioned. This is the most productive, versatile, resilient agricultural land in the country. And again, it's best for long-term production of food and other crops. So here in Illinois, we're really fortunate to have significant amount of high quality soils, but of course that's not a surprise to any of you, and they're likely. So between 2001 and 2016, a time span of 15 years, Illinois lost over 244,000 acres of farmland. And of that, 34% became what I referred to earlier, that low density residential. So again, this is significant because in these areas in Illinois, low density residential was 40 times more likely to be converted to urban and high density development compared to other ag land. And as we know, once ag land is converted, it is lost forever. So looking ahead, the same initiative, Farms Under Threat, identified that if these current trends or these trends that we've identified continue, Illinois will see an additional 363,000 acres of farmland converted by 2040, and up to about 450,000 acres in the case of runaway sprawl. To put that into context, that represents an area nearly 2.5 times larger than the city of Chicago, and equates to the loss of 1,600 farms and 3,400 farm jobs. So in Illinois, we expect two-collar counties of Will and Kane, in addition to Kendall County, to be the hardest hit counties in the context of agricultural land conversion. But it's not all bad news. If we choose the pathway of what AFT is referring to as better built cities, where we plan for efficient growth, we create denser, livable cities, and protect farmland, we can avoid the conversion of over 211,000 acres of farmland. In the context of the continuous US, Illinois ranks 11th of acres of nationally significant land that we expect to be impacted by this urban and low density residential development by 2040. As mentioned, nationally significant ag land, so that area in green in the previous maps is 50 times more likely to be converted to development than any other agricultural land. And I think some of you are likely aware that the US Department of Agriculture just recently released the highly anticipated results from the 2022 Census of Agriculture. This census is referred to as a complete count of farms and ranches and the people who operate them for every state and county in the United States. And this census is conducted every 5 years. So nationwide, the number of producers held steady at around 3.4 million, while the number of farms and land and farms is continuing to decline. In Illinois specifically, we saw a loss of over 1,500 farms, which is a loss of about 2% of farms in 5 years. We also saw about a 2.5% decrease of acres of farmland since 2017. What's more is we know that farmers in Illinois and like across the country are an aging population. The average age of farmers in Illinois now, according to the most recent census data, is 58.6, showing again that the age of farmers in the state are trending older. So more specifically, I wanted to call out that 65% of farmers in the state are 55 and older, and 40% of all producers are 65 and older. So what that means is there's more than 5 times as many producers that are 65 and older than there are that are under 35. Finally, this demographic of farmers age 65 and older, they own 5.6 million acres, which is equivalent to about 21% of the ag land in the state. So of course, that leads folks like AFT and others to ask, what is the future of these farms that may change hands in the coming decades? Now, I know I've thrown a host of numbers and statistics at you, and that may not be how some of you think. So I wanted to convert this into what does this tell us? What is the story that we're trying to, or the picture that we're trying to paint here? Ultimately, we know a seismic transition of farmland is coming. 70% of farmland will change hands in the next 20 years, but that transition is really happening now. We know that it is during these generational transitions that land becomes more vulnerable. We also know that threats to the land supply are mounting. Housing crises, sprawl, renewable energy needs, changes to our climate are all impacting our supply of farmland. There are people that want to farm, but we know that there are persistent barriers for getting them suitable access to land. Land is too expensive and access can be insecure even within a family transfer. So a shrinking supply of land and active agriculture use creates additional barriers for beginning and established producers seeking suitable land. And what's more, a smaller pool of land devoted to agriculture limits our opportunities to establish some sound farming practices or management systems that can address some of our greatest challenges regarding climate and natural resources, which L'Oreal will talk a little bit more about later.
Yeah, but before we jump into that, I want to highlight one other component of AFT's Farms Under Threat research. And this was an edition called The State of the States, which built on the data collection that Angie just spoke about, that hard data of land loss, where, and the demographics. We created a agricultural land protection scorecard to show how states have or have not responded to the threats of agricultural land conversion. To develop this scorecard, we assessed 6 policy tools commonly used to protect farmland, support agricultural viability, and provide access to land. Those common policy tools were purchase of agricultural conservation easements, or PACE programs, that permanently protect working farmland and ranchland, land use planning policies that manage growth and stabilize the land base, property tax relief for agricultural land that improves ranch and farm profitability, agricultural district programs that encourage landowners to form areas which protect farmland, farmlink programs that connect land seekers with landowners who want their land to stay in agriculture, and last, state leasing programs that make state-owned land available for farmers and ranchers. The results of the scorecard around the nation show that every state has taken steps to retain land for agriculture, but that all could do more. And this is especially true here in Illinois, where we have one of the highest percentages of nationally significant land, that 84% number that Angie mentioned earlier, while we also score amongst the lowest for policies and programs that address the threat of conversion. So you can jump to the next slide. And so we took that policy scorecard, moved from analysis to recommendations. And I want to note that, AFT thinks there's no silver bullet here. Since conversion is driven by several interrelated factors, states need to use multiple policy approaches to protect their agricultural resources. Choices will depend on the nature and extent of the threat and what's going on in each state and the underlying causes, the policy framework, and what kind of support there is on the ground to protect farmland. Our recommendations center on the 4 there on the slide. Encouraging smart growth, that includes everything from housing policies addressing density to planning for agriculture and not just around it. This is key to that better built scenarios that Angie mentioned earlier. It's how we go from 363,000 acres lost to 211,000 acres lost. Protecting agricultural land, that second bullet, PACE programs, that's a primary tool. That's the process of creating agricultural land easements, and Angie's going to touch on the mechanics of those in a minute. And we'll talk a little bit about potential policy here in Illinois at the end of the presentation. This next one, advancing smart solar, that is a framework that AFT uses to look at solar development. And it's especially important here in Illinois, where the growth of the solar industry is both welcomed by AFT. We know that we need to make that transition, but it's also moving very quickly. As of last fall, there were more than 110,000 acres of projects in the queue for development. And I'll note that Angie presented the information earlier. We have not fully assessed how fast solar development is happening. And we're working on that now. But just know that here in Illinois, there's some counties seeing as much as 10% of their arable land base projected for conversion as of today. And that last bullet there is farmland access. We simply need to promote policies which support a new generation of producers and creating viable, thriving businesses. We know that having them on the land is the best mechanism we have for protecting farmland and promoting healthy soils. And we'll touch on the land transfer navigators project here in a minute as well. But Angie, hoping you can kind of dive into some of the mechanics of conservation easements and how they work. It's kind of a niche topic, but hoping you can make it easy for us to understand.
Thanks, Dylan. I will do my best. I get the lucky job of trying to explain relatively kind of complex tools, which we call conservation easements. But I'll take my time, and I invite you all to drop your questions into the chat. No silly questions here. So as Dylan mentioned, protecting farmland is something that AFT feels very strongly about. And I'm going to talk about how exactly that is done. The tool to permanently protect land is called a conservation easement. And conservation easements are deed restrictions that landowners voluntarily place on their property in order to protect important natural and cultural resources through limiting certain activities and uses. So again, conservation easements are voluntary legal agreements between a landowner and a holding entity that typically permanently limit a property's use. And in a lot of cases, they're limiting development in order to protect the conservation values. And conservation values can be things like soil, habitat, watersheds, anything of that nature. And land and conservation easements, this is important, remains privately owned and generally do not require public access. Now, what is an agricultural conservation easement? So an agricultural conservation easement, sometimes referred to as an ACE, ACE, is a type of conservation easement that permanently protects land for the sake of present and future agricultural use. And what that means is that non-agricultural development is permanently restricted in order to protect the farm viability of the property. So agricultural conservation easements, they enable landowners to sell or donate some property rights while keeping others. A helpful analogy, one that some of you may have heard before, is to compare the rights of property ownership to a bundle of sticks. But we're a farming organization, so we're going to talk about a bunch of asparagus in this case. So each spear represents a separate right. Landowners, which some of you may be, have the right to use, the right to control, transfer, enjoy, and exclude others from their land, of course, subject to federal, state, and local laws. So landowners use agricultural conservation easements to limit the use of their property and grant the right to enforce this limitation to an easement holder. Easement holders are typically land trusts or local municipalities, maybe a local town, county, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. The easement, as we say, runs with the land, meaning it remains in effect after the land changes owners because it's recorded on the property. The public agency or land trust then holds the easement and monitors and enforces the terms of the easement and to ensure that they are upheld over time. So once that land changes hands, the responsibility of the entity or the land trust or whoever it may be is to ensure that easement is still being abided by. So after granting an agricultural conservation easement, landowners retain title to the property and can still farm the land. Often can still restrict public access, use it as a collateral for a loan, or sell the property. You still retain those rights as a landowner. Land with an agricultural conservation easement stays on the local tax rolls, and landowners continue to be eligible for state and federal farm programming. To give specific examples, this graph shows typically what is discussed when drafting an agricultural conservation easement to protect a property. Agricultural conservation easements allow agriculture by right and typically do not require a specific type of farming. Most easements permit building and maintaining agricultural structures like fencing and irrigation and hoop houses, things that are important to the viability of the farm. Permanent agricultural structures like barns or pack sheds, farm dwellings or farm labor housing may be allowed, but sometimes can be limited to a designated area, which is sometimes in an easement document referred to like the farmstead area or a building envelope. And sometimes they are limited in size. The bullets here in the center column under conditional represent these typical conditions as associated with these uses and activities. So easements can also include management plans, but don't always, to support the conservation values of the farm. So they typically promote conservation practices to protect specific natural resources. And Florial is going to talk a little bit more about this in a little bit. So non-farm development, over here in the prohibited column, like subdivisions, non-agricultural commercial buildings, these types of developments are almost always restricted, meaning that they're not an allowable use as part of the terms of the easement. So it's important to note that the point of agricultural conservation easement is to be flexible to agricultural uses and recognize that farm operations change and evolve over time. These are permanent agreements, so we want to ensure that easements are not designed to be too restrictive because, of course, we cannot predict what the future of agricultural will look like, and we want to ensure that farms remain viable to the future. So this is going to get a little technical. So again, please drop questions into the chat. So how to protect your land with an agricultural conservation easement. So typically how this works is landowners can protect their land by working with a purchase of agricultural conservation easement program or a PACE program, like Dylan mentioned, or a land trust. Landowners usually initiate this process by contacting a potential easement holder, so, a PACE program or a land trust. The easement holder gathers information about the property to determine its suitability for protection and eligibility for public funds, either through state or federal programs. And this includes soil types and current land uses. Staff from these entities will often visit the property to understand landowner goals, confirm information about the farm operation, discuss the easement terms, and identify areas for protection. The easements either cover an entire parcel or sometimes portions of a property are excluded for various reasons. And that's part of the conversation and negotiation that you would go through in securing an easement. The value of an agricultural conservation easement, or called the easement value, is generally the fair market value of the property, shown here in dark green. So the fair market value of the property if you were just to sell it outright before the easement is granted. And then you subtract the value of the protected property as determined by a qualified appraiser. So easement values, that kind of maroon color, are tied to the restrictions included in the easement. In general, the more restrictive the easement, the more it reduces the value of the property, shown in the light green. And then as a result, the easement value is greater. Easement value will also be impacted by non-farm development. So when looking at how to value an easement, places experiencing more non-farm developments or residential, commercial, industrial, whatever it may be, tend to have higher fair market values because that's the value of development that is happening in that area, and can create a greater difference between these two values, creating a greater easement value of the property. So to summarize that, how to value an easement is you look at the fair market value, you look at the restrictions of the value, or the restrictions of the land, and you subtract the two, and that gives you the easement value. So essentially what you're purchasing, what values of the land you're purchasing through the restrictions agreed upon within the easement document. So once all parties agree to the terms of an easement, the transaction continues as typical real estate transactions do, including due diligence like title search and survey. It's important to note that this process is not usually a quick one. It can take up to a couple of years to get to a closing. And that depends really on the complexity of the transaction and some of the funding sources that may be accessed. So why agricultural conservation easements? Why do folks pursue this option? So farmers invest a lot of time, money, and energy into their land. When it comes to time for retirement, they often worry about that land may someday be covered in asphalt. An agricultural conservation easement can provide a retiring farmer with the assurance that the land will forever be available for agricultural use, helping to protect that legacy that they have helped to build. In the case of easement sales, landowners can also use the proceeds to make improvements to their land and operation or expand their operations. So I've seen cases where landowners have used the funds from easement sales to adopt conservation practices, construct, expand, or repair agricultural buildings or structures, buy equipment for farming, including processing or also marketing agricultural products, buying additional land, as I mentioned, paying down debt, or financing retirement or other family needs. Another important piece to agricultural conservation easements is they can be a helpful tool to facilitate the transfer of the farm or ranch to a successor. Permanently protected agricultural land is usually more affordable to farmers and ranchers because, as we just talked about, the agricultural conservation easement limits the future non-farm development, which then, of course, may lower the fair market value. Easements usually reduce the value of land for estate tax purposes, which is important when in considering transfer, and can help facilitate that generational transfer. And to the extent that the protected value is lower than the fair market value, the estate will be subject to a lower tax. And in some cases, an easement can reduce the value of an estate below the level that is taxable, effectively eliminating any estate tax liability, which is, of course, an important consideration when thinking through how to pass your land and your farm operation to the next generation. And with that, I will pass it to Floreal to talk a little bit about some of the environmental benefits of protecting farmland.
So recalling what Angie shared about land use conversion and the loss of our farmlands, when our agricultural lands are at risk, our environment is also at risk. Protecting farmlands through easements is critical to conserving our natural resources, including soil, water, and air. The good news is farming can both grow our food and provide essential environmental resources. And next slide, please. So an investment in permanent farmland protection is an investment in soil health. Agricultural conservation easements can lead to positive environmental outcomes and ensure our productive soils are not lost forever to development. Like Angie mentioned, once farmland is converted to housing or infrastructure, it's essentially gone forever. There are no structures in place to be able to take houses and roads off the land. And if that did exist, then the soil would be really irreparably damaged. So with this, there are a lot of flexibility in adaptations that are supported by easements. Easement language is really non-prescriptive to be able to account for changes in conservation management strategies as our understanding of best practices change and develop over time. This really gives farmers with conservation easements ample room to implement farming strategies that best serve the land. So a tool that's often very useful in complementing easements are management plans. Management plans are a tool that help farmers reach conservation and resource management goals, often in tandem with the easement holders' goals for the property. These provide a roadmap for achieving these goals without being legally binding as in an easement. A common practice is for easements to require a management plan on areas with highly erodible soils. And this is to explicitly prevent further soil degradation where there's high risk. Other management plans might include cover cropping, no-till, rotational grazing, or silvopasture practices to ensure soil health. And again, these are collaborative efforts and really aligned with the goals of the farmers, the practices that they're using, and their production style to be able to achieve shared goals, not to tell farmers what they need to do on their property. And conservation easements really introduce the possibility of long-term planning for land management. When land is permanently protected, landowners can make investments in long-term conservation infrastructure and management strategies, knowing that the land will be in production in perpetuity and that they're not putting time and money and risk, having that high risk of engaging in these strategies just to have everything ripped out and turned into development. Depending on the easement holder and the management plan stipulations, there are sometimes additional funding opportunities for beneficial land management practices on protected lands. And next slide, please. So we have to address what farming looks like in the context of climate change, because the effects of climate change are increasingly impacting the agricultural community. Natural disasters such as fires, tornadoes, droughts, and extreme temperature changes are increasingly disrupting the growing season and creating poor outcomes for farmers and our food supply. This photo of the barn here was taken just a few weeks ago in the aftermath of the first recorded February tornado in Wisconsin, which hit just outside of Edgerton, Wisconsin, a little bit south of where I live. And this event really disproportionately impacted farmers and is really going to be detrimental as the farming community starts planning for the growing season. And next slide, please. So fortunately, while our farmlands do face increasing threats from these extreme weather events and that are associated with climate change, there's also they also present ample solutions for mitigating some of the root causes of climate change. So as we know, excess atmospheric carbon is a really strong driver of climate change. And farmland is playing an increasingly crucial role in drawing carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it in the soil. And when we remove land from production through development, we lose the plants and the soil's ability to capture and store carbon from the atmosphere. So what this means is that well-managed farmlands serve as a carbon sink where carbon is removed and stored. And this is in opposition to carbon sources, which are areas where carbon is produced. So we really need the carbon sinks to be able to balance some of the sources of carbon. And when we keep farmland in production in perpetuity through easements, we're retaining and keeping the land's ability to serve as a carbon sink. And this is a really critical environmental service. And so something that happens in tandem with development is that we're not just adding houses to a landscape, and we're not just removing carbon cycling abilities of the land. Development introduces new sources and additional sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And these are introduced through when buildings and infrastructure are added to the landscape. These sources can include emissions from vehicles, building materials, and other non-renewable energy sources that otherwise would not be on the landscape. Protecting farmland also means that we're not placing production pressure on other lands. So when agricultural land is taken out of production, it means that land in other areas is farmed more intensively to accommodate the deficit in production. And intensive production often indicates poor environmental outcomes. For example, increased disturbance really reduces the soil's ability to function properly. And any techniques to remediate this degradation are often really costly and high input. And if we're protecting farmland from the get-go, we're more evenly utilizing our natural resource base and maintaining a relationship of stewardship on lands that we are farming. And then finally, farms sometimes aren't just croplands and can contain forested areas, wetlands, and prairies. These habitats are really essential for biodiversity, providing wildlife habitat, and of course, that carbon cycling that I mentioned earlier. An easement placed on a property may or may not envelop these associated areas and bring them under the umbrella of protection. And this is really just dependent on the easement coverage area, and the stipulations that Angie mentioned are part of the easement development and placement process. So overall, keeping farmland is a really critical tool in climate change mitigation, and placing conservation easements means that we're retaining the land's ability to provide key environmental resources. And with that, I will pass it back to Angie.
Thanks, Floria. So what is AFT doing to help address some of these challenges regarding farmland protection and farm succession, and addressing some of our environmental challenges of today? The answer is a lot, and we don't have time to cover all of the things in the remaining 20 minutes of our time together. But we did want to highlight a couple of programs that are active and are particularly relevant to the folks in this space. So as we talked about, nearly 300 million acres of American farmland are expected to change hands in the next 20 years. And really, we are in the midst of that transition as we speak. So as agricultural landowners prepare to retire, the future of the land they steward is at a critical turning point. How and to whom they transfer their land will have an enormous impact on the next generation of farmers and opportunities available to them. So in response, AFT, American Farmland Trust, has developed a multi-year, multifaceted program to address challenges affecting senior landowners, grappling with transferring their land and operations, also helping the next generation within farm and ranch families involved in a transfer, and providing support to organizations interested in providing land access and transfer support. So this is the Land Transfer Navigators program. And the goal of this project is to dramatically increase the transfer of farm and ranch land to a new generation of producers. And we are doing this, AFT is doing this in partnership with 36 other organizations across the country. So a critical piece of the Land Transfer Navigators program are these actual navigators that I'm describing. So AFT has trained 52 individuals across the country in efforts to provide direct one-on-one farm succession and land transfer support to folks navigating this challenging process. I myself am a navigator working in the Midwest to provide this one-on-one support. And the idea is that I help connect you to resources. I can help guide conversations within your family to accomplish these goals. If you're interested in receiving farm succession support or just exploring what that could look like, I encourage you to reach out to me, and I will be sure to drop my contact information into the chat here in a bit. And I'll pass it to Dylan to talk about another action that AFT is taking to support farmland protection and transfer in Illinois.
Thanks, Angie. So place this map back here that Angie had at the beginning of the presentation, just showing how much of Illinois' agricultural land is nationally significant. And I'd like you all to keep that in mind as we move to the next slide, if we can real quick. This is state PACE program activity as of January 2022. And as you can see, there's not a lot of overlap between those two maps. Angie just spoke about the land transfer navigators project, and that's something that AFT really believes in and supports and thinks is necessary. But as I mentioned earlier, we don't see any silver bullet. And so we think that it's the combination of multiple different policy and program approaches that can help protect our land. And this PACE component is really important. And if we go to the next slide, I'll share a little bit about current legislation pending in Illinois that we want folks to know about. It's the Illinois Agricultural and Natural Resources Legacy Act, and it would create that statutory authority to develop PACE work here in Illinois. The act provides a state incentive for private property owners to voluntarily conserve both natural areas and farmland that are at risk to conversion to development. While, and this is important, enhancing utilization of the federal, local, and private funds to benefit those lands. As Florial mentioned, it is also the wetlands, forests, and other areas that are necessary to support our climate goals and soil health goals, in addition to making our farms more viable. And this bill addresses that as well. And one other consideration that we haven't touched on here is, in face of the generational concerns that Angie mentioned, and along with other historic investments that the federal government, USDA, has made in conservation, they included about $1.4 billion for farmland protection in the Inflation Reduction Act back in 2022. And this bill here in Illinois would set up our state, as well as our farmers on the ground, to be able to capture some of those federal dollars, providing a critical match with the Ag Legacy Fund at the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. And we can move a notch on that policy scorecard if we can get this passed here in Illinois. So good to note this week, as we're in the midst of a wonderful event and production put on by Illinois Stewardship Alliance and the Illinois Environmental Council and the Soybean Association Soil Health Week, but also know that tomorrow there'll be Soil Health Lobby Day, and advocates will be all around the Capitol meeting with lawmakers to promote this legislation along with others. Last quick note, because I think I glossed over it, this is SB 2011, SB 2011, and it's currently sponsored by Senator Doris Turner, Senator Andrew Chesney, and Senator Murphy. And with that, I know that we have a number of really good questions in the chat, so I want to leave some time to talk about them. And
I think you're muted somehow, Dylan. That's weird.
Did I go mute? Sorry.
Yeah.
So yeah, I want to get to some questions in the chat, because there were some really good ones. Angie, the first one I thought you could touch on was, how does AFT work with or support local land trusts to promote ag conservation easements? And you've got some good experience up there in Wisconsin.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Sydney. At AFT, we're really fortunate to not only have our regional programming, like the folks here on the call who represent the Midwest regional staff. We also are, for those of you that don't know, American Farmland Trust is actually a land trust. So we also have our land projects team that work across the country doing farmland protection in many states, in many geographies. So the answer is, we do things many different ways. One way specifically here in Wisconsin, we lead a partnership where we have secured federal funding for the purchase of agricultural conservation easements, and are helping distribute that to a lot of our local partners on the ground. So local land trusts and other municipalities with PACE programs. to be able to match their easement funding with the federal funding available from USDA. And we do that through helping them navigate the process with NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, and by handling some of the back end stuff around getting that funding into the state and making it available to these land trusts. And that's through the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. Lots of acronyms there. We also make ourselves available to talk through any challenges that may come up in navigating easement transactions. So kind of brainstorming about ways that we've approached things. Our land projects team is particularly great at supporting local entities and how to, if a project is particularly complex, we provide resources. We also have the National Ag Land Network where anybody can join. And there's tons of forums where folks go and say, this is what I'm navigating, how have folks across the country dealt with it? And that's a really active space to build community around land protection. And then final thing I'll mention around that is we have the Farmland Information Center, which has just a host of resources that you can really get lost in around farmland protection and all of the technical guidance that are available there. But as you know, staff people were available to, we just pick up the phone and talk to folks at local land trusts and help think through some of the challenges that they may be facing. So it's really a host of different ways to approach that.
Thanks.
Chris?
And then, yeah, there was a host of really good questions from Christina Foster also. Angie, you want to take on the highest and best use determinations, and then I can get into capital gains?
Sure. So to answer your question, Christina, the question is fair market value based on highest and best use determinations? Yes, the answer is yes. So typically when in an easement, going through an easement negotiation, the entity, whether that be the land trust or the local PACE program, Purchase of Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, they will commission an appraisal. And what the appraiser typically does is identifies the highest and best use of the property. And that's considered, the fair market value, so that, so that green box here, highest and best use. And then they use, and they do that by using sales comparisons from around the property of interest. And then they basically look at, well, what is the easement restricting on the land, and what is the difference? And that's how we come up with the easement value. But starting with the highest and best use is how that works. And I'll pass it to Dylan for the capital gains questions.
Yeah, these are great questions, Christina. And the simple answer is yes, but I'll expand on it a little bit more. So with capital gains, it's important to remember that an easement is a capital asset. Participants, generally, they're paid on the appraised value of the easement at the closing in exchange for removing the non-agricultural development potential of their property. And because that property is expected to increase in value over time, the easement is a capital asset. Therefore, the sale of an easement may be subject to federal and state capital gain taxes to the extent that the proceeds exceed the basis in the property. IRS allows the entire basis instead of just the portion that can be attributed to the conservation easement to be deducted from the proceeds. That means that any capital gain will be reduced by the amount of the basis. So example, a farmer sells an easement on their farm for $1,000 and the basis is $100. He would owe federal and state capital gains tax on that $900. And then one other bit that I want to touch on is that you can use a like-kind exchange here because an easement is considered an interest in property. So you can use a 1031 like-kind exchange to trade the value of the easement for additional land. The taxpayer doesn't have to recognize the gain on the sale of the easement. Instead, we'll need to allocate the basis between the retained acreage, now subject to the conservation easement, and the carryover basis of the easement, now allocated to the newly acquired property. And I think that touches a little bit on the next question, Christina, about how can the farm use funds to improve our, let me look back here, ways to use the funds to improve the farm that reduce taxes. Yes, I mean, when a landowner sells an agricultural conservation easement, proceeds from the sale can free up capital to reinvest in their agricultural operation, acquire additional land, invest for tax purposes and value on the farm. And so there's a lot of ways that you can use these funds to reduce taxes. And I see one other question in the chat about the bill here in Illinois, and I can speak to that a little bit. It was introduced last session in 2011, and it was a very good conversation and negotiation amongst stakeholders all across the spectrum. You know, we're at a point trying to figure out terms here in Illinois with everyone. And so I think there's going to be some continuing conversations and amendments made to SB 2011 as we progress in session. But as with most things in Illinois right now, most legislation in Illinois, everything's moving really slow. So we're waiting till after the primary to see a lot of movement on that bill, but I do think we'll see some amendments to language, and hopefully we can come to agreements with everybody on terms to get it moved forward here in Illinois. And I would follow that up because of where conversations are at in Illinois with a question for you, Angie, not seeing any others in the chat. If you could speak to the value of permanent protection as opposed to termed protection when we look at PACE programs and how they operate and work with NRCS and ASAP ALE.
Sure. If I'm understanding the question, why push for permanent protection essentially over termed easements?
Yeah, given the rules for ASAP ALE
Yeah.
and why that's valuable in face of the funds and what we're looking at.
For sure. So, I mean, in short, as Dylan mentioned, there is an unprecedented amount of funding that has come available through the Inflation Reduction Act, through the federal government. And the bill that Dylan mentioned, the Natural Resources Legacy Act, is trying to make available matching funds for that federal money that we want to bring into Illinois and invest into the state. The important piece to note, though, is this federal funding through programs like that I mentioned, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program or the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, both of which are through the USDA. The requirement to be able to receive cost share from these programs is that these are permanent agreements. So these are not termed easements. These are permanent easements that run with the land in perpetuity. If we're looking at a termed easement, a 15-year or 30-year termed easement, then this federal funding that is coming down and being implemented on the ground across the country would not be available through a termed easement program. So I think that's an important thing to consider, because that would mean that Illinois or whatever program or state that's looking at term easements that would be leaving that money on the table because you would not qualify, I guess, is really the quick summary of that.
Mm-hmm. And I ask Angie just because that's where a little bit of conversations are at in Illinois, or trying to figure out if we want to, push for permanent easement or permanent easements or termed easements. And at AFT, we think it's important to allow permanent easements and fund them so that we can access those federal funds and provide the match. Thank you for that, Angie.
Yeah, of course. So we have 2 minutes left. I'm going to resume sharing. Because it's my understanding that folks can get CEU credits for this participating in this webinar. So can you all see the QR code, hopefully? Yes, okay. So the QR code is up on the screen. I think you can just scan that with your phone and receive your professional development credits. And then we have 1 minute left if anyone else has anything else they'd like to share or ask before we depart.
I
Hey.
think that's good.
Yep.
Yeah.
Hearing none. All right. Well, I appreciate everyone's time. I
Oh,
appreciate.
one last one.
Yep.
One last one. Who can I contact in Illinois? And I think that you can probably contact me, Christina, to have any conversations about this. Dylan Cook, I'll add my information in the chat here.
Yes. Great question. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. We will be sharing some resources and the recording out, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.